So last lesson we were looking at the wealth gap that formed during the 19th century under the rule of classical liberalism, and how the fact that people were living in extreme squalor, you had a very high infant mortality among the working class, and that the average life expectancy of a manual labourer in Manchester was only 17. So clearly liberalism has caused a lot of issues, and it looked to kind of reinvent and revise itself by addressing this issue of equality and understanding that equality isn't the same thing as justice, and that a just society needs to be formed. So it became very clear that classical liberalism was unsustainable without reform, and a massive moment of awakening for capitalist countries was the Wall Street crash of 1929. Essentially what happened, because of unregulated trade, you had stock markets taking unnecessary risks, and it just led to the financial crash. But one of the things that's so essential for capitalism is to have people spending, something called the cycle of prosperity. So it is essential that people buy things, because if people buy things, then more jobs are created. If more jobs are created, people are earning more and working less, then they're able to buy more. So the cycle is cyclical in that sense, it goes round and round. But you can only buy so many things. So if you're thinking about a car, for example, you're not going to be buying a car every month or every year or anything like that. So once you own that car, you're going to keep it for a long time, which means that things like the car manufacturing went down because people weren't buying cars as much, and so forth. So essentially this leads to the Great Depression throughout the 1930s, a place where there were extreme wealth gaps. There were people were struggling, people were starving, people didn't have a roof over their heads, people were living in shanty towns, which were named Hoovervilles after the American president, and it was just a time of suffering for people as a result of this financial crash. And it became very clear that capitalism wasn't enough to provide a healthy and good society. And the issue is, when people, or especially working classes, when they are pushed too much, when they are unhappy, they will rebel, they will have a revolution, they will riot. And there was that real fear of a communist revolution brewing even in America, which Dr. Andrew Hartman is in the process of writing a book about, called Marx in America. So one of the things that happened around the world was this rise of populism, this rise of far-right ideas who claim to have all the answers for your problems. And a lot of those answers include blaming minority groups in their respective countries. One of the main parties was the Nazi Party, who rose to power in 1933. And bear in mind, even though it was a small majority, well, it wasn't really a majority, but a small win, the Nazis were voted in. And they were voted in because they were promising a resolution to capitalism. They were promising, instead of it being the bankers taking all the money, instead of it being business owners getting rich, they were going to help little business owners. They were going to make it so that every single person in the country had a car, had a holiday, had a house, and had a job that they could be proud of. So what happened with the failures of capitalism and the failures of liberalism is other ideas tried to take its place. So this idea was fascism. The same thing happened in Italy as well under Mussolini. So you have the rise of fascism in that sense. You also have the civil war in Spain, the battle between socialism and fascism too. So it's a time of chaos, it's a time of suffering, it's a time of hardship. So it becomes very clear in terms of an economic management system that laissez-faire does not work. In America, FDR stepped in and regulated laissez-faire, didn't completely remove it, but did a lot to intervene, and that actually helped to save American capitalism in that sense. And if it hadn't been for FDR, America could have potentially become a socialist country. It could have become a communist country. It could have also become a fascist country. And if you want to read something about that time period, a fantastic book is a book called It Can't Happen Here, and it explores this time period. It's a work of fiction, but based in a historical context. So the fiction is written in this time period, as if a fascist leader becomes president of America. So I think it's a really good book to read just to understand a bit more about this period. Another fantastic read is Of Mice and Men, which really highlights the human suffering in the Great Depression, as does The Grapes of Wrath, but that's a longer read. So the replacement, the alternative system put forward was by John Maynard Keynes, one of the most famous economists of all time. He actually has the concept named after him, Qingyunism. So Qingyunism, named after John Maynard Keynes, was written in his work, The General Theory of Employment and Interest and Money, in 1936. And essentially, the principles of Qingyunism are that you cannot trust the market to self-regulate, because the market doesn't look at the best interests of the people. It looks at the best interests of capital, so money, and that's not going to provide a good standard of life for people in a country. So employment is determined by demand in the economy. So with the more demand there is in the economy, i.e. the more people buying things, the more employment there will be. And you will have more people buying things if they are employed. So it's about trying to do your best to ensure that you have 100% employment, as much employment as possible. Because if people have jobs, then people can spend. If people can spend, then the economy is doing really well. So government spending needs to inject demand into the economy. So you saw in the video the example that if a car factory is going out of business, it doesn't make sense to let it go out of business, because the car factory was built there, you have somebody building a petrol station to help fuel the cars of the people travelling to work. You also have somebody building a restaurant which will serve the people in the car factory, and so forth. So if you were to just let that car factory close, you'll have two businesses closing as well. So it makes sense to either pour money into the car factory or potentially to build roads in that area to stimulate the further growth of jobs and so forth. He actually did say it's better to have somebody in a factory pushing a button that connects to nowhere than it is to have unemployment. So sometimes just giving people jobs for the sake of it. So this idea became particularly popular during the Second World War. And if we're thinking about the Second World War, it was a time of horror and hardship. You had people sacrificing their lives to go and fight against Nazism. You had people dying to save Britain. You had people losing their sons. You had people dying in the Blitz, which also led to the destruction of housing in their areas. So the Second World War was a time of real struggle for people in Britain. So William Beveridge, during the war, he wrote a report which is named the Beveridge Report. And in this report, it's outlining the promises that the British government should make to help the people and to make the people happy after their sacrifices in war. And so he was a civil servant, and he essentially identified the problems in Britain as 5 evil giants. So the evil giant of want, so not having food; the evil giant of ignorance, not having a good education; the evil giant of disease, so people having cholera, people dying of illnesses because they're all concentrated in bad housing; squalor, the fact that people are living in overcrowded housing, and idleness as well, people not having work. So what this is you can see these 5 giants, and you've got Beveridge tackling these giants one by one, and want is the first one that he's going to tackle. And this report was incredibly popular, and people in the country were really excited by it. So it's no surprises then that when the Labour Party come into power after the war, that they adopt this report full-heartedly. So it becomes a very clear idea after the Second War, after Labour's election victory, that people in Britain want to have governments which continuously tackle these 5 evil giants. And laissez-faire has failed, and laissez-faire was bad. So this constructs something called the Postwar Consensus. So this is a political cooperation in post-war British political history. It's a fascinating phenomenon in this country, and that is essentially that whatever political party was in power from the Second World War to the late 1970s was committed to the principles of the Beveridge Report, and that's that post-war consensus. They have a consensus, they have an agreement that they will work towards tackling those 5 evil giants. That's both Labour and Conservatives. This ends in the 1970s when Margaret Thatcher comes into power, and she has her neoliberal revolution, which returns Britain to many of the ideas that came out in the 19th century of classical liberalism. So this includes things like having an NHS, having it so that nobody should die because they cannot afford to see a doctor. You had incidents of women having their child being ill and having to put onions on their throat thinking that would cure them. You would have women not going to doctors because they wouldn't want to spend the money on themselves and wanted to save it for their children. So that's why the death rate was so high. So it's about having the NHS and having free at the point of use healthcare. And I think one thing that we've made a mistake on in this country is that we think that the NHS is free. It is not free. It's something that we all pay into. And it's about saying that everybody has the basic right to not die of a preventable illness. So it's giving everybody the right to a decent healthcare. You also had principles like the free school meals principles, which was a continuation of the ideas from before the First World War. So having it so that children, when they go to school, they have at least a good meal a day, a good hot meal a day. You have as well the building of council homes. So obviously many people's homes were destroyed. They can't afford to rebuild them. So the government created council houses. And it's this idea that there are pillars in society that we need. So we need to be healthy, fed, and the prevention of squalor. So everybody should have a roof over their head. So with a post-war consensus, it's not right that you have the excess amount of landlords. People shouldn't be buying houses just to rent them out for a profit because you're denying someone the basic right of quality housing. So it's about saying housing is a commodity, it's something that we need. It shouldn't be something that is left to the fluctuations of the market. People shouldn't be paying more than 2/3 of their wages on rent, which is actually the case in Brent right now. So obviously classical liberalism would be quite anti these changes, because if you're going to say have council houses, you're taking away the opportunity of a landlord to make a profit, and that's not his fault that you don't have that incentive to do that and work hard. Obviously that's a load of rubbish, but anyway, so they would say that this is unfair because it's not encouraging human beings to flourish, it's creating something called the Nanny State and so forth. So this welfare state then is a state that takes responsibility for the social welfare of its citizens. So this rise of welfarism is about trying to guarantee equality of opportunity, trying to make it so that, if you're hungry because you don't have food at home, you can't concentrate in school and you can't succeed. So it's trying to make it so that everybody has those fundamental basics so they actually can have the opportunity to be equal, to achieve something in society, to flourish as individuals. So it's about promising that from the cradle to the grave, from the moment you're born to the moment you die. And it's reinforcing rules as equality as fairness principle. So inequality should benefit the least well off. And this is a speech from Nye Bevan, who was the sort of architect behind the NHS. And in it, he's highlighting that. So he was the health secretary under the Labour Party when they came in after the Second World War, beating Winston Churchill, which I think was a big surprise to Churchill. So this is him talking about why we have an NHS.
I'm proud about the National Health Service. It's a piece of real socialism. It's a piece of real Christianity too. We had to wait a long time for it. What I had in mind when we organized the National Health Service in 1946 to 1958, and remember when we did it, you younger ones, this is immediately after the end of the Second World War, when we were asked, Sir Winston Churchill then said, a bankrupt nation. But nevertheless, we did these things. And there is nowhere in any nation in the world, communist or capitalist, any health service to compare with it. Now, the National Health Service had two main principles underlining it. One, that the medical arts, the science and the healing should be made available to people when they needed them, irrespective of whether they could afford to pay for them or not. That was the first principle. The second was that this should be done not at the expense of the poorer members of the community, but of the well-to-do. In short, I refuse to accept the insurance principle. I refuse to accept the principle that the National Health Service should be paid by contributions. I refuse to accept that. I refuse to accept it because I thought it was nonsense. If you hadn't fully paid up, you couldn't have a second-class operation because your card wasn't full of stumps, could you?
So you can see the reasons there behind the creation of the welfare state and the creation of the NHS. And I think just the idea that we are the only country that has a service like that is something to be really proud of. Although, due to the neoliberal reforms, especially from Tony Blair, it has been increasingly privatised. And I think the welfare state that Nye Bevan was referring to there in 1948 is very different to the one that we see now, and it has been eroded substantially since, as we've become a lot more individualistic as people in this country. So in terms of this idea then, the drunkard in the gutter is just where he ought to be, how would a modern liberal respond to this?